All right. Well, thank you everyone for being able to join us for the first talk of the IGB DEI seminar series. Because the IGB is at the University of Illinois and we have active partnerships with Indigenous communities in North America, I'm going to start by reading the IGB land acknowledgement statement. So the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology at the University of Illinois is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggle for survival and identity. The IGB acknowledges the peoples of these lands as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of the University of Illinois for the past 150 years. We are obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native people is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Okay, so also because this is the first talk of the series, I wanted to briefly discuss some of the IGB diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we're planning to roll out. So I'll do this really quick before introducing our speaker. All right, so just some of the initiatives that we're rolling out is that we're creating a web space at the IGB, and you can see the link for the URL right there. And this web space will have resources for learning about racism and other inequities in science and society, as well as information on future speakers in the seminar series and other events. So I encourage you guys to all go to the web space and browse it. In addition to that, we are going to help instill culture change at the IGB. In coordination with leadership, we're creating a system for IGB themes to directly create and be evaluated on DEI activities in STEM. Themes will have access to seed funds for DEI activities and will also be evaluated on DEI during theme reviews. And then lastly, we're expanding the Committee on Diversity to include members from the Executive Committee, IGB staff, and the Postdoctoral Society. We have also had the COD task force has been formed where anyone from the IGB community can join to help with DEI. The COD task force meets every 2 weeks, suggests DEI infrastructure, and helps implement the changes suggested by the IGB COD and leadership. So if you have an interest in joining the task force, there's a email right here at the bottom that you can go to. Okay, now to introduce our speaker. Kendall Powell is a freelance science writer and editor who works in science journalism and communications covering life and biomedical sciences, careers in the sciences, and the culture of scientific research in the field and laboratory. She trained as a cell biologist before making the leap from lab bench to laptop and graduated from the University of California, Santa Cruz Science Communications Program. Her work has appeared in Nature, Science, the Journal of Cell Biology, Discover, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. Today, she will talk to us about why inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility make your science stronger. So let's welcome Kendall.
Thanks. All right, so let me do this. All right. So as Ruben said, I'm a freelance science writer. I have been a regular contributor to Nature Careers for the last 17 years. And in that time, I've written a lot about different aspects of biomedical science. And I've also developed a beat writing about careers in STEM and what I would call academic and lab lifestyle issues. It might seem a little bit strange for me as a white, cisgender, able-bodied woman to be speaking as an expert today on this topic of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. But I will be very clear that my expertise comes from my work as a journalist and from interviewing hundreds of scientists over the years, and especially those scientists who come from historically underrepresented or marginalized groups. It's through my work as a journalist that I hope to shed some light on exactly what we mean by underrepresentation and equity, and why it matters to your science. I also hope to illustrate for you some of the very real barriers that underrepresented scientists face. And finally, I hope to give you some practical advice and ideas about how IGB can walk the walk on diversity and inclusion efforts, and convince you that, as the title implies, this is not only the good and right thing to do, it is also the scientifically sound and smart choice. So I'm going to start with some data. So first, what do we mean by underrepresentation? This is just a quick definition. Underrepresentation is when a demographic group is not represented in STEM careers at whatever level we're talking about, PhDs, postdocs, tenured professors, as it's at its demographic percentage of the general population. So for example, Blacks represent 12% of the US population. They earn 9% of the STEM bachelor degrees, but only 5% of the earned doctorates in STEM fields go to Black students. So who else is underrepresented in STEM? So women in the life sciences these days are actually a little bit overrepresented at the PhD level, but at all levels above that and in all the non-life sciences, women are still underrepresented. They earn about 33% of the physical science doctorates and 25% of engineering and math doctorates. Native American, First Nation, or Indigenous students make up about 0.8% of the US population, but they earn only 0.2% of the doctorates in STEM. Hispanic or Latinx students, again, that group is 18% of the US population, but they earn just 7% of STEM doctorates. In the US, about 11 to 12% of the adult population is living with some type of disability, but students with disabilities earn only about 6 to 7% of STEM PhDs. And if we're talking just about mobility disabilities, that drops to 1%. Students who come from lower socioeconomic households, we believe are underrepresented. We don't have direct information on this, but we can use a pretty good proxy, which is the level of their parents' educational attainment. So that is tracked. And in the US, about 63% of US adults do not have a bachelor's degree or higher. But among STEM PhD students, only 29% come from a family where one parent has less than a bachelor's education. So it's pretty safe to say that we're not reaching all of those students from lower income households. And then finally, LGBTQ scientists, we don't have good numbers on this either, and that is because neither the US Census nor NSF or NIH tracks LGBTQ status. So I'm going to be using sort of an even more crude proxy there, but really what this is about inclusivity of these scientists. In 2019, in the United Kingdom, there was a survey of LGBTQ physical scientists. And in that survey, nearly 30% had considered leaving their STEM workplaces because of the climate there. And nearly 1/3 of trans scientists had experienced exclusionary or harassing behavior in the last year. And just one more stat there, only 44% of gay men in that survey reported being out to everyone at their STEM workplaces. And of course, underrepresentation for all of these groups, including those that identify as women, gets worse as we progress beyond the PhD level and up the ladder of the academic ladder. So what do we mean by equity? I hope you've all seen this cartoon somewhere before, but just quickly, on the left side there, equality means giving everyone the same tools to try to overcome a barrier. Whereas equity means giving individuals the tools that they need to overcome that barrier. And you can think of the boxes in this picture as a financial aid package, where the girl in the middle needed twice the amount of aid that the person beside her needed to be able to overcome the barrier. And then the other individual didn't need financial aid at all. They needed help overcoming a barrier from a physical disability. So I've also seen this cartoon with a third panel where the fence is removed altogether, and that's called liberation or removing a systemic barrier. So what are some examples of barriers that block entry to STEM careers? And when I'm talking about entry to STEM careers, I'm mostly talking about entry to graduate school, because that's where most of us start our STEM career journey. So what do we mean about barriers to that entry? I think sometimes people can be dismissive about these barriers because they're not real or they're not seen as real. And people tend to think of science as the great equalizing meritocracy, where if your science is good enough or you just work hard enough, then you'll overcome the obstacles and succeed. But today I'm probably going to shoot some holes in that working hypothesis. One very common barrier is financial. So this woman here is working as a waitress. It's very hard for undergraduate students who are working 2 jobs to put themselves through college can find the time to do the independent research that we all know is really key to being competitive in a graduate school application. A couple of other examples come from directly from my reporting or my colleagues' reporting. So there was a student at a tribal college who wanted to do a summer research experience, but she had an 8-year-old son and she could not leave him for the entire summer to go work at a university even just 3 hours away and leave behind her support network, which is on her reservation. So her advisors worked out a great solution to this barrier, and that was they came to a compromise that she could spend just 4 weeks at the university that was 3 hours away collecting data in the field, and then she returned home and spent the rest of the summer doing the data analysis. It was a very simple solution that worked really well for that student. This other example is about sometimes the barrier can be a person or an advisor. This was a transgender physics master's student who wanted to apply to PhD programs, but she was flat out denied a recommendation letter from one of her professors who told her that she was quote unquote too eccentric for graduate school and her chances of becoming a tenured professor were just too slim. This is a heartbreaking example to me of where gatekeeping can turn really ugly. As she says in her own words, he was probably right that I wouldn't become a tenured professor, but I would have liked to have had the chance to get a PhD. And a very simple solution to this barrier would have been if another faculty member in her department had stepped forward and become her advocate and written her a letter. So I really want to encourage you to think about what are the real barriers that might be preventing students from underrepresented groups from reaching IGB as PhD students or postdocs. What could be some of the solutions to removing those barriers? If there aren't enough underrepresented candidates who are applying to programs, why is that? Would pairing up with a nearby minority serving institution, like a tribal college, a Hispanic serving institution, or an HBCU, help? Would that help to create a critical mass of undergraduate students coming to your campus and then having a pipeline into your programs? So a little word about systemic racism and biases. I'm sure you're all aware of the death of George Floyd at the hands of police and the protests that it inspired this summer and the renewed energy to combat racial injustices. But I think it's important for us to think, does systemic racism and do other systemic biases really hurt the scientific enterprise? In her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, Ijeoma Oluo breaks down all of the common myths about affirmative action. And she notes that obviously affirmative action has not solved systemic racism, as Black men still only make 73 cents to a white man's dollar, and Black women and Hispanic men and women make even less. And as she says in the book, either you believe the disparities that exist in jobs and education exist because you believe that women and people of color are less intelligent, less hardworking, and less talented than white men, or you believe that there are systemic issues keeping them from being hired, promoted, paid a fair wage, and accepted into universities. So this is from my own work, again, some quotes from early career researchers from underrepresented groups working in science. And they show that systemic biases are alive and well in academic science today. So the first is from an undergraduate student who said, coming from Mexico, I felt like I should be working in fast food or in the fields, not studying as a biochemistry major. From a non-binary PhD candidate, they said, when you misgender me as he, him, instead of they, them, you are saying, this space isn't created for you, and I don't see you as your true self. And then from a postdoc at an R1 university, he said, I am one of two Black postdocs on a floor with at least 10 laboratories. At poster presentations, I often get asked, who did all this work? Even though I'm clearly stated as the first author. Both of these last two individuals also described being repeatedly followed by campus police or questioned by security guards when they showed up to their lab buildings after hours. These are examples of experiences I've heard time and again in my reporting. When you aren't represented, when you don't feel seen, when you don't feel welcomed or fully included, and you don't have role models to look to that have risen up the ranks above you, all of that adds up to an overwhelming sense of not belonging in science. It's imposter syndrome on steroids. But there's also, you don't have to just believe my anecdotes, there's also a lot of hard data about why diversity matters to science. So why should group leaders care about having diverse groups, whether we're talking about a lab group or a theme at IGB or across the whole institute? Why does this matter? So several studies have shown that papers with diverse groups of authors get a citation or an impact bump compared to papers that have non-diverse, homogeneous groups of authors. In 2013, Jonathan Adams analyzed 25 million papers on the web of science and showed that papers with international collaborators in the mix of co-authors received a citation bump compared to papers that had all domestic authors. And he noted that this bump has been on an upward trajectory since 2001. So it's increasing. In 2018, Badur Al-Shebli, Talal Rawan, and Wei Li Woon published a study where they analyzed 9 million papers, and they found that diversity in age, gender, discipline, and ethnic diversity among the authors all correlated with higher impact of the papers, but ethnic diversity was the strongest effect. They did a really great control matching experiment where they took ethnically diverse papers and then controlled for all the other types of diversity among the authors. And they calculated that ethnic diversity resulted in an impact gain of 11% for papers and 48% for individual authors. That's not too shabby. These researchers, however, will freely admit that they do not know what the mechanism is at work behind the citation bumps that diversity gives papers. It could simply be a network effect, they say. It could be the fact that if you have a broader and more diverse group of authors, they themselves have broader networks, and those networks are sharing and citing that paper more often. But they also said they really hope that it also includes the cross-fertilization of culture and ideas. From my work interviewing group leaders who have diverse research groups and who are dedicated to increasing diversity in science, they have found that diverse research groups have more of that cross-fertilization of ideas, and that increases the frequency of those aha moments in science. These groups also have better success at reaching research participants from minority, marginalized, or indigenous groups, and their findings are more likely to be trusted or adopted by those groups. Diverse groups have students and postdocs who think outside the box, bring fresh ways of troubleshooting, new thought processes to the lab, new ways of approaching problems, and often they find more distal research connections. The people in these groups feel free to bring their whole selves to work and to work in the way they're wired, and that means they can focus on their science and be more productive. But to form a diverse research group effectively requires that you get to critical mass. And research shows that critical mass is about 15 to 30% of the total work group. So again, if we're talking about a larger laboratory, a theme at IGB, a department or an institute, you need 15 to 30% to reach critical mass. And when you do, then underrepresented groups experience less stereotyping and higher inclusivity. So anything you can do to create safe, welcoming, and inclusive spaces to reach that critical mass will help you to attract and retain underrepresented scientists. Okay, so hopefully you already cared about diversity, and now I've convinced you that you can also raise your scientific productivity by promoting diversity. But how do we fix the problems within our own groups and departments and institutes? And so now in the next part of my talk, I'm going to share with you the best practices that I've learned from my reporting. And I think that, this year, 2020, whether you are male, white, financially secure, able-bodied, neurotypical, and or cisgender, I firmly believe that this is the year for majority scientists to start listening to their colleagues about what would help. Listening is the very first step to acting as a good ally. An ally is a verb in this context. We're not talking about ally versus enemy. We're talking about rather advocating for other people and generally being a decent human being. So one of the best things you can do is to broadcast or signal your lab's values and that your lab space or your office space is a safe space for underrepresented scientists. This poster is one very obvious way to do that. And if you like it, you can download it at the creator's website, and you can even modify it with your own biological model of choice. So first I'm going to touch on how do we fight back on gender bias in academia. And I just will say that for all of this work in diversity and inclusion, it should be shared across departments and institutions. It should not fall just on the people who identify as women in a department or just on the minorities in a department. So this first point is very obvious. I'll just maybe talk about the rest of them, which are less obvious. Women need to be able to see the departmental data on salary and promotion information to be able to negotiate effectively. So providing that transparent and confidential information is really important. Departments need to understand that students hold women professors to higher expectations, and they give them worse teaching evaluations across the board, and that is even when everything else is held constant. So something that departments can do to mitigate those effects of bias is to throw out any evaluations that reference looks or appearance or dress or bodies. And they can do that for all professors across the board. I've heard a lot of universities are considering throwing out all of the 2020 teaching evaluations simply because teaching was so rough in this year. Another thing departments can do to help mitigate some of this is have standards for how students are supposed to email their professors. So women also get more of the camp counselor type of emails where students are looking to them to help solve personal problems or crises, and that is really not part of their job. Make sure you have zero tolerance for sexist remarks or jokes in workspaces and have very public ways of shutting these down. You can use different styles for that public shutting down. It can be other humor, sarcasm, very direct comments. But I really want to encourage people to think about this, because one very public sexist remark in a conference or in a seminar can do untold damage to the early career scientist in the audience, because it tells them this field doesn't value women. Don't have any pregnancy penalties. Make sure that all early career researchers have paid parental leave. You can hire technical support to keep projects moving through those leaves. NIAID has really interesting stipend program that is specifically to hire lab technicians to carry on postdoctoral projects while a postdoc is on paid parental leave. And then things like grants, tenure clocks, and PhD requirements should all have automatic extensions that equal the time of that parental leave. And then finally, departments need to be better at tolerating and accommodating the tiny people that women are feeding, raising, and teaching at home this year, you know, across all of the workspaces. Okay. What are some diversity and inclusion best practices for recruiting and retaining underrepresented scientists? So there's some things you can do to combat implicit bias in your recruiting process. I think it goes without saying that admissions and hiring committees should reflect the diversity you want to see when that's possible. But some of these are less obvious. So one thing that hiring or admissions committees can do is to set up a rubric of the criteria they're looking for and the weights on those criteria beforehand, so that this is a very transparent process. You can consider blinding the names on applications if that's possible. You can rank applications from, instead of from best to worst, you can rank them with a simple 0, 1, 2, where 0, they have none of the criteria, 1, they have some, and 2, they have all of the criteria. And then the committee can agree beforehand that they will discuss all of the applications that get a 2. You can also set bold hiring and recruiting targets and give yourselves deadlines for those targets. So for instance, that might be you want your student population, your undergraduate student population, to match the city's demographics. Or it might be that you want to double your underrepresented faculty in a certain time frame. And then on this side, we have ways you can support early career researchers who are from underrepresented groups. And again, this goes back to critical mass, helping establish networking groups on campus, or meetups, or cross-departmental clubs. Again, it might have to be across an entire campus to reach critical mass, but it's really important to give underrepresented scientists that time to network. They also need that information, the transparent information on stipend and salary information. And then this last one, it seems like it goes without saying, but it doesn't in a lot of instances. And that is that meeting people's most basic biological needs while they're at work is really important. So this might come up again, but you know, make sure that your lab buildings and your office buildings, office spaces, are meeting the federal requirements for ADA accessible bathrooms and lactation spaces. And those lactation spaces are required by federal law to be private and separate from the bathrooms. But go beyond the minimum federal requirements and do things like have access to gender neutral bathrooms and have menstrual products provided for all who need them. Okay, so at the PI or lab group level, what are some best practices? So something that PIs can really do as lab leaders is to try to flatten out the lab hierarchies and even out the playing fields so that everyone's on firm, flat, equal standing. And some ways to do that, there's some great digital tools out there. I'm sure lots of you are already using them in your labs. But basically just using these tools to have equal access to lab protocols, shared data, shared lab software, things like that, can really just keep things open and transparent for everyone and accessible. You can use a Signal or a WhatsApp group text thread to keep everyone in the loop, and also to provide a way for people who are working after hours and have a quick question for them to get it answered instead of having to wait till the next day. You can also have a Slack channel with everyone in your group included, and that gives people the space to have that conversation where they're talking about research progress, or they just reach out to everybody to see who wants to grab lunch. These open, transparent lines of communication are really important, and they also make it a lot harder for inappropriate comments or bad behavior to occur. Lab leaders can also post codes of conduct and lab value statements, travel fund policies. They can post them on their lab website, or they can put up physical hard copies in the lab itself. Lab leaders should also be the one to set the tone of the group on diversity and inclusion. So, suggest a journal club or discussions of these ideas to talk about the people behind the science. And then make sure you're making accommodations for pregnancy, lactation, disabilities, and neurodiversity in your group. And accommodation here does not mean special treatment or singling people out for their otherness. What it means instead is to adapt to or to make fit the needs of. And again, this goes back to giving individuals the tools that they need to succeed. So for a student on the autism spectrum, this might mean lowering the lights or the noise levels near their workspace. PIs can have the university accessibility office do an assessment of their lab space to make sure that it's ADA compliant. And then I heard this trick from a PI, which I thought was really brilliant. He says every time he walks through the doors to the laboratory building, and there's the blue button with the wheelchair symbol on it, the accessibility button, he pushes it to make sure that the doors are working. And if they're not, he calls it into maintenance, because you want those doors to work when the person who needs them comes through them. There's lots of great inclusive software out there now for people with learning disabilities, or for scientists for whom English is a second language. I've just noted some of them there, but these are especially helpful for people who struggle with writing. So MindView is a mind mapping program, and I've heard people say you can take all of your figures and your charts and, kind of mind map out a manuscript and then click a button and it will turn it right into a Word document, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, as the group leader, make sure you're stating the group's commitments to diversity and inclusion often, and especially whenever a new person rotates into the lab. So what are some best practices at the departmental level? So again, department heads are going to set the tone for the department, and they need to be thinking about the very big things like, is everyone in the department safe? Are everyone's biological needs being met? And then is everyone's voice being heard and being valued? If you're going to plan a conference or an event in your department, make sure you have childcare available. Make sure you have travel funds available for people who might need them. Make sure you're holding that event in an LGBTQ friendly space or region. And then make sure your event has some time and space for those underrepresented group meetups, again, for critical mass and networking purposes. If you're in charge of a fieldwork season or a field expedition, make sure you're making accommodations for gender diverse individuals and women to be included and safe, but also make sure that everyone is getting equitable training for that expedition, especially if it's going to be in a remote or dangerous place. Everyone should be fully trained to handle any crisis that might come up. This might range from shooting polar bears in the Arctic to driving ATV vehicles to get from point A to point B. Everyone should have the same training so that everyone can be safe in those situations. If you're a department head, make sure you're hosting diverse, inclusive seminar speakers for your seminar series. And then finally, make sure your search committees are following those best practices we just talked about a minute ago. And I think sometimes chairs of departments also have a little bit more power here, and they can actually question if a candidate pool for a job or position comes back and it's all male or it's all white. They can sort of question that, and sometimes they even have the power to reject it and send the committee back to the drawing board. And it may be that you need to ask around or advertise or publicize in targeted ways the job ad so that you get a more diverse pool of candidates the next go round. Okay. Finally, what are some best practices at the institutional policy level? So again, having family-friendly policies across all levels of your students, faculty, and staff is important. That includes having affordable childcare on campus or nearby, having those parental leave policies be standard for grad students and postdocs, and then again, automatic extensions of things like tenure clocks. If there are Black Lives Matter or Pride or Indigenous cultural events happening on your campus, make sure you're supporting and promoting and advertising those things. Institutions can really play a role in helping students that are trying to, that are going through the process of changing their legal name. And they can also help in erasing or amending their dead name paper trail. And this is important, especially for students who would like to get degrees that have their preferred name on them. All campus communications of all types should be using uniform gender neutral language throughout. This means using they, them, theirs pronouns, using any gender rather than either gender, and using words like partner and spouse rather than husband or wife. Institutions can also consider cluster hiring. This is the hiring of several faculty members at once across departments and across a broad range of disciplines. Sometimes this is done for people to work on interdisciplinary themes, but it also just allows for much broader job descriptions than a typical departmental description might be. And research has shown that that can increase diversity on campuses. So that's something to consider. Finally, institutions need to be collecting that data institution-wide and publishing accountability reports on their progress in these areas. Okay, so this is a big lesson that's been learned by the senior women in STEM. If you want to make headway against systemic gender bias, you absolutely must have the buy-in from your male colleagues as well. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go over the practical day-to-day things that allies in STEM can do to help women, minority, and LGBTQ scientists. So for women, definitely do amplify and back up women's voices and ideas in meetings. Don't make them be like Kamala Harris and have to say, I'm speaking here. And so don't speak over women or steal their credit for their ideas. One easy way to do this is to just simply interject if someone's being talked over and say, excuse me, I didn't actually get to hear everything that Holly had to say. So you can do it in a very polite but firm way. Do your research, know the literature on gender bias in STEM, and then you can push back in conversations about it using that sort of killer data. And then, so the things I've highlighted in yellow on these slides are going to be applicable to all groups. That's what the color coding means. And so also do point out and correct biases that are made by undergraduates' comments or biased actions or comments made by undergraduates. Don't participate in manels. Say no to manels if you're a speaker or a moderator or a conference organizer. Especially in the life sciences, there is no excuse for a panel of speakers that is all male. So if you're asked to be on a manel, please offer up a suggestion of a qualified woman who could speak instead in your place. And if you're a moderator of sessions at a conference, the research has shown that if you seek a question from a woman in the audience first in the Q&A session, then more women will subsequently speak up. So think about doing that if that's possible. Don't swoop in as a white knight to save the day, especially if the woman in the situation is in a vulnerable position due to power dynamics. Do correct your colleague's sexist speech or behavior later and in private. And finally, don't ask women to prove or relive their harassment experiences. And again, that's in yellow because that applies to everyone. All right, how to be a good ally for minorities in STEM. Do actively and overly encourage underrepresented minority students. That is how you're going to tell them they really do belong in science. Do promote Black and Brown excellence by finding opportunities for students and postdocs to present their research and lead research projects. Again, do your research. And then also Sometimes it should fall to white colleagues to have the lab conversation about racial injustice and to be the one to bring that up, because sometimes it's easier for them to start those conversations. So you could suggest a journal club or a book group dedicated to that topic. Do not discount, dismiss, or explain away the experiences of racism that occur. These experiences can range from daily microaggressions to things as serious as death threats from other students. And don't be neutral, be actively anti-racist when you can. A good resource for this is the book, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibrahim Kendi. And then don't put the burden of diversity and inclusion work and the service and the mentoring on the shoulders of minorities. Again, this is work that should be shared throughout a department or an institute or a theme. And don't be guilty of committing microaggressions or tokenizing. Microaggressions include, the very obvious ones, like assuming and saying that somebody must be a diversity hire, but there's also non-obvious microaggressions, and don't be guilty of those either, like saying something like, oh, your accent is so adorable, or where are you from originally? And then don't tokenize. That means don't extend invitations only to lift the numbers of minorities in the crowd. Be sure that instead you're being a welcoming space that includes minority scientists as invited speakers and co-authors because you want their expertise and you ask them to offer their input and you ask them to collaborate and to lead projects. And minority scientists will tell you they definitely know the difference of when they're being invited and valued and when they're just being invited for the color of their skin. Okay. All right, this is the last ally slide. So this is how to be a good ally for LGBTQ scientists in STEM. Again, it was on all 3 slides. Do your research. As researchers, you should know the data on these issues, and it's really not too much to expect you to do a little bit of digging into the literature on these issues if you're a majority colleague. And educate yourself. Don't expect the underrepresented scientists to do that work for you. If you really don't know what all those letters at the top of the slide mean, then it's easy to just do a quick Google search and find out. Okay, do normalize and practice the use of proper pronouns. So you can put preferred pronouns on work badges, work IDs, at the end of your email signatures, on title slides of presentations you're giving, department websites. The more we practice and the more we use and advertise them, the more natural it becomes. Also, use gender neutral language in all your meetings, emails, policy documents, and anytime you're not sure of someone's gender identity, you should be using they, them pronouns and other gender neutral language. Again, if there are pride events or LGBTQ groups on campus, make sure you're promoting those events, but also make sure that if you're there as a non-LGBTQ scientist, that you're being a respectful guest. Don't make cis heteronormative assumptions and don't misgender people. So those assumptions can include making assumptions about partners' gender identity, about pronouns based on outward appearance or style of dress. And then if you do misgender someone by accident, then just apologize and correct it publicly, but do it briefly. You don't need to make a big deal about it. Don't ask invasive or deeply personal questions. Don't ask about body parts, about surgeries or medical treatments. Don't ask about their sex life or their dating life. Again, be aware that there are microaggressions in this space too, such as, you're too pretty to be a lesbian, or you can't be bisexual because you're married to a man. And then again, don't hold an event or a conference in a hostile place that's hostile to LGBTQ people. This is a really great resource put out by the Human Rights Watch, which is a global map of all of the countries in the world that still criminalize same-sex relationships or diverse forms of gender expression. And then finally, for all of these slides about allies, don't tie yourself up in knots. You know, for this one in particular, talking about people's sexuality and gender identity at work can be awkward, but we kind of need to work to normalize it so that our LGBTQ colleagues don't feel the need to hide such a huge component of their identities when they're at work. If you make a mistake in any of these situations, it's okay. We're all human. We're going to make gaffes, but just apologize and correct your mistake and move on. Okay. So I think I've hopefully convinced you that what STEM needs is a bit of a sea change. And I'm so excited to see that University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is a charter member of the AAAS program Sea Change, and that stands for STEM Equity Achievement. This is an evidence-based, competitive self-assessment, and it's modeled on the most successful gender equity initiative that I know of, and that's the Athena Swan model that's out of the United Kingdom. Sea Change is not about helping individual students or postdocs in this case. It is about encouraging institutions to examine their own campus culture, policies, and procedures that are disadvantaging or excluding faculty, students, and staff on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, or other aspect of identity. I really encourage all of you to get involved with this program on your campus, to get involved in collecting the data, and to really track your own demographics in this. You know, it can be tricky in terms of privacy issues, but there are plenty of ways to do it. You can make it voluntary, you can make it opt-in, you can have aggregated data, and you can have de-identified data. It's really important to have that data because first it tells you the magnitude of the problem on your campus. And then it tells you whether your diversity and inclusion efforts are moving the needle in the right direction. And finally, if you're collecting outcome data, it's going to tell you where those underrepresented scientists are going and when they move on from your campus or your lab group or your department. And I would say everyone should be, you know, involved, should be as rigorous about this data collection as you are about your own science. And so I'll just stick with the nautical metaphors here for a moment and say that it's true in this space that a rising tide lifts all ships. The diversity and inclusion work that we've talked about, it's really true that what's good for underrepresented scientists and women in STEM is also good for everyone else in STEM. Improving the work culture and the environment to make it accessible to all people is going to improve the work environment for majority scientists too. These issues are not separate from the other ways that we need to improve STEM careers, namely ensuring better work-life balance, improving mentoring and management of people, ending academic bullying, and paying increased attention to mental illness, mental health. Those are all important to all scientists in their careers. And I'll just end with that, and then I'll be happy to take questions.
Great job, Kendall.
Thanks.
Folks can just type in questions to me and I can read them out and ask Kendall. I suppose while we're waiting for folks to write in questions, I have a question. So in your experience in interviewing minority scientists, have you come across any stories about ways that scientists have used their lived experiences as someone in a marginalized group to approach a scientific problem in a unique way or the kind of out of the box way?
Sure. So yeah, I have one example that just happened to have with me that I had cut out of the talk for space. But so I interviewed some scientists in New Zealand who have a very diverse lab group, and they have a group of students who are Indigenous Maori people. And they were working on drowning education programming for Indigenous communities. So across the world, apparently, Indigenous communities are more likely to have higher rates of drowning. And this group was working in that space. And they realized that, it turns out when, white leadership comes in and says, you really should wear a life preserver when you're on your boat, that doesn't work as well as bringing a Maori perspective to the education program. And so they had developed an education program, a drowning education program based on both sort of Western science principles, but also based on their Maori traditional knowledge, and knowing that, there's a great deep respect for the ocean built into their culture. And so they used that, to have a much more effective program. So that's one example.
Cool. Here's a question by Ava Fisher. The statistic about a critical mass of around 30% being important, is there data on whether this 30% needs to be for all axes of diversity, or is it helpful if people are from different underrepresented groups?
That is a great question. I don't recall that specific study. I don't recall the details from it. I do have the citation here. If you want to go look it up and see if they addressed that. I would say, just speaking, from my own experience, I would say that I would say get to that critical mass however you can in your particular group, or your particular, whether it's a lab group or a department or a larger group. I think it's probably going to be better if you can have 15 to 30% of each of those diversity axes, but that's not always possible in many places. And so I think shoot for the broader diversity first and go from there. I think there is a lot of intersectionality here, right? So I didn't actually talk about that word, but the parts of our identity that we bring with us to work, we all have intersections. And so, I think it's useful even to have that 15 or 30% be a broad diversity, because people are going to bring all of their experiences and all of those pieces of their identity to that group and have shared experiences across, whether they're a woman of color, it doesn't matter which color, right? I think that's, going to be true for groups. And I was trying to find that reference. I think it is Nielsen, and it's PNAS, and I want to say it's 2015, but I can find the exact reference and send it to you in an email, Ripon, or to share later.
Okay, we can put it up on our resources page.
Yeah.
Here is a question from Elizabeth Murphy. What are the most effective ways to advertise jobs to have a diverse applicant pool?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't dived deep into that question, but that's a really good one. I think the thing I've heard most often about that is that you just have to work harder, right? You can't just put out a job ad in the normal way that most departments do, which I think is right now on their website, and maybe people still advertise in Nature and Science. But, I think you have to get more targeted. You have to go to, you have to get on Twitter and put it out there on Twitter, and then tag some of those groups that are on Twitter, like Black in STEM, Black AF in STEM. There's multiple of them. You really have to work a little harder. You have to reach out to colleagues in other places, and you have to be direct and say, we're looking for a diverse pool of candidates. Do you have someone you can, suggest? So rather than just putting the ad out there and letting people, apply, make sure that you're targeting specific networks or specific groups. And just, again, that requires some more footwork, but it's worth it to get a more diverse pool of applicants.
Let's see, here is a question from Cecilia Gently, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. There is a large gap in underrepresented groups and women when it comes to university patents, industry collaborations, and university startups. Is the sea change also addressing these gaps in inventorship, entrepreneurship, and related innovation activities on campus?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I didn't see anything specific to entrepreneurship within the sea change literature that from AAAS, but I don't see why that shouldn't be part of it. I think that's a really good point that we overlook sometimes, and definitely having, you know, I think sea change, as a member of Sea Change, you know, University of Illinois has the power to figure out what they want to do, right? I mean, it's all about institutions doing a really deep self-assessment. And so I think that's a great opportunity for that to be a space that's looked at. You know, obviously your tech transfer office on campus will hopefully have those statistics to hand and could see how you're doing as a campus. And I think that would be a great piece of this to put in there. Like I said, I didn't see anything on just my quick read of the AAAS website, but I think encouraging women to also think about, you know, entrepreneurship, starting up a biotech, starting up, you know, going into industry is something that, you know, should be an equal part of it, right? Because there is still a gap there as well.
Yeah, that could be a good question to ask the OVC DEI.
Yeah.
Other questions? We have a few more minutes. So Kendall, I know you cut out some of the slides for the talk to keep it on time. Just wondering if there was something that you had in your original talk that you...
Oh, I do actually have one more that I did cut out. So if there's any question of whether, you know, systemic racism and biases play into, you know, how ideas are adopted in STEM, this is it's a very busy slide, which is why I cut it, because I think it takes a lot to explain. But this is a study from this year by a group at Stanford. And what they're doing is they're illustrating this thing called the diversity innovation paradox, and they wanted to know if it occurs in STEM careers. And indeed it does. So this has been shown in other fields, this diversity innovation paradox. And what that is that diverse team members tend to come up with more novel ideas and innovate more often, but those innovations and ideas are not taken up and adopted as readily as the ideas of non-diverse workers. And so this group wanted to know if that also occurs in science. And sure enough, it does. So this is a little complicated, but this is showing novelty here is measured as the number of new links. And these were they looked at 1.2 million PhD dissertations between 1977 and 2015. And they measured the number of new links that the dissertation introduced between concepts, and they measured that as novelty. And so as you're more underrepresented in your field, so this is women in computer science in 1994, at the very far end, they're way underrepresented in that field. And then men in aerospace engineering in 2004 are way overrepresented. So this is underrepresentation to overrepresentation. So women who are underrepresented and also non-white researchers who are underrepresented in their field do make more discoveries and novel links. But sadly, the impact of that novelty, and that was measured as how much it was taken up in the subsequent literature, has the reverse relationship. So the more you're overrepresented, so here being male or being white, the more your ideas are taken up by the field. So you can kind of think of this slide as quantifying the good old boys network, it's one way to think about it.
Cool. I'm going to look that paper up.
Yeah. Bas Hofstra is the first author.
Okay, well, we're coming up on 2 o'clock. So just thank you again for joining us for this talk.
Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me. And I wanted to thank my my editors at Nature and Science, especially my editor at Nature Careers, Karen Kaplan. She's been a real champion of me doing these types of pieces and giving them the space in the magazine. So I appreciate that. And I also drew from the work of my colleagues, Virginia Guin, Sophia Chen, and Ruth Terry. So I want to acknowledge that as well.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I think that went very well.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Great.
We had maybe 55 or so folks.
Yeah. Are you, do you want a list of who attended, or?
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
Is that, okay. All right, I can run that report for you and send it over. And then I'll get your meeting scheduled for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right, we'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.